Welcome to Legal AF and CAA. Today we have Mike Podhorzer here to talk about his most recent weekend reading on the Supreme Court, and not just the Supreme Court, on the Roberts Court. So Mike, tell us about your most recent piece of work.
Sure, and great to be here again with you, Lisa. I think that in these first weeks of the blitzkrieg we've seen going through the government by the unelected Musk and Trump just basically destroying our assumptions, we've seen some really pretty heroic victories in the lower courts, and that's given people a lot of hope, right? That we are going to be able to stop this. And what I wanted to do in the Substack was both laud everyone who's putting such important hurdles for them to go through, but to make sure we all understand that we, over the last decade and a half, have been developing two legal systems in this country. One that I call a kind of hyphenated rule of law, where it is a, judiciary of laws and not men, and another starting from the top down with the Supreme Court, which has been hijacked, where they just do whatever they want. And that we have to be ready in this narrowing window against authoritarianism, not to see what Roberts engineers as meriting being called the Supreme Court, right? It is not the institution we've been taught to trust. It is an agenda-driven operation on behalf of the billionaires who started the Federalist Society project and made sure all of them were on the court to do exactly this. And so that's really what we have to get ready for, is that when the Roberts Court goes along with any of these Trump moves, right, we can't just make that the end of the conversation as we have for the last couple decades. Oh, well, nothing to do. The Supreme Court said this is what, right? We have to go back to a really important American tradition that literally goes back to writing the Constitution, which is the idea that the Constitution is the contract between the governed and the governing, right? That its principles have to be understood and legible to everybody to have any credibility. It's not like the terms of service on your iPhone, right? Where you sign up and then you need a technocrat to figure out what you just signed, right? This all worked when we all understood what constituted the United States. But for the last almost 20 years, it's just been whatever the Roberts 5 or now 6 say it is on any given day.
That's right.
So this Substack is meant to help us prepare for this era.
Well, I really appreciate it, Mike. I really enjoyed reading it as you were working through it and thinking about why we need to talk about this as the Roberts Court and not just the Supreme Court or the Supreme Court. In fact, a lot of the coverage by mainstream media of the court's decisions really neglects to tell this story routinely. There was a transformation in the coverage of the Supreme Court when we finally got investigative reporters covering the court rather than access reporters who sort of tell the story as the court wants it told, as if these are legitimate decisions, when we've actually been facing a host of illegitimate decisions by the Roberts Court for coming up on 20 years now, and that those decisions have paved the way for this moment of the assertion of this extreme notion of executive power, this dictatorial power in the form of Trump, basically embodied by Trump. But it's not just those legacy decisions like Citizens United. It's also the decisions by John Roberts, who orchestrated the immunity for Trump, the unprecedented immunity, which did break the contract, among other ways in which this court has broken the contract. But the idea that a president is immune from criminal prosecution, that he can do no wrong when he's acting in his so-called official capacity, that even things he says in that context can't be used in a court for trial, for other actions by him. It's extraordinary. And Roberts did this, but not just this. Like you said in your newsletter, some people are talking about there's a constitutional crisis coming if the Trump administration doesn't follow orders by the court, but in fact, we're well into a constitutional crisis by this court. And you talk a bit about some of our early history in America, including some famous words by one of my heroes, Frederick Douglass, along with Abraham Lincoln, and the importance of the people's interpretation. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that.
Sure, and I would go there and say, but I really want to add something to what you were saying, because if we've learned one thing from the Roberts Court, it's that for those of you, us like you, who are just have been, you know, on this from day one in the various roles you've played, and me a little bit later coming to this, sometimes even when we see these horrific decisions like Citizens United or immunity, our imagination doesn't even grasp how bad they are, because with citizens we didn't understand with Citizens United that it opened the door to creating this new extra constitutional position, co-president,
Yeah,
right? That without Citizens United, there's no Elon Musk in the White House right now, right?
right,
Give, like, literally before Citizens United, he couldn't give $1, let alone 270 or 90, whatever it's going to end up being, disclosed, right?
right.
It just didn't, literally for over 200 years in this country, you couldn't do it. They opened the door. We thought of a lot of bad things that did happen, but now we have a co-president techno-fascist, right?
An unelected co-president
Right,
that ruling that unleashed this tsunami of cash outside of the disclosure rules for limits on how much a single individual could put into a candidate's campaign. It really is extraordinary. Now, I will say, I was out of the gates, along with Rob Weissman from Public Citizen and a couple other groups, immediately upon the issuance of that decision in Citizens United, saying that this was a constitutional crisis, that we needed a constitutional remedy because the court had wrecked the meaning of the
right,
First Amendment. But you're right. Even then, I could not imagine that the result would be that the richest man in the world would somehow become an unelected co-president by basically spending extraordinary sums in Pennsylvania and other states, and then would
right,
be emboldened by this same Supreme Court's decisions, starting to pave the way for this executive power that is autocratic, that is dictatorial in nature. That then these forces would come together in this this Musk Trump co-presidency, or in some ways, a co-dictatorship, because they're basically treating the
right.
law as dispensable. That none of the laws, none of the rules for personnel, none of the rules that have been negotiated by unions, none of the rules for budgets in terms of the allocation of money for these agencies, for their missions, none of these rules apply to them, that they can just dictate or suspend them. It's extraordinary. And I'll get back to my original question to you in a second, but
Yeah,
and as you point out, we have these lower court judges, which the lower courts have a number of Trump appointees, Biden appointees, Obama appointees, and some Bush appointees. And so far, the lower courts have been holding the line on the idea that these rules matter, that there are rules before an executive branch can act or do X or Y or Z. But those cases are all headed to the Supreme Court in one form or another. And this Roberts Court has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted to protect our rights.
exactly. And the second part, too, on the immunity, we were all understandably aghast at the way you described it. That in that decision, they were basically saying he couldn't be held criminally liable for basically doing anything. But it was even worse than that, because in defining his duties, they actually loaded on all sorts of privilege for him, for any president, that was also breaking new ground and that he's exploiting, right?
Right.
But back to history. So a few things. See, these are things that Americans used to understand. So, for example, Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural after the Dred Scott decision, saw it perfectly. He said, if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. Right? You cannot say what happened with Roberts any more clearly than that. The One of the things, though, that has gotten in the way of the public understanding exactly what a dictatorship it's been has been the simultaneous sort of liberal legal establishment going along with something called judicial supremacy, which is the idea that that the Supreme Court has the final word on everything, and that the Constitution is just the province of legal technocratic experts, that there's no public role in it. And as a result, every time one of these decisions, no matter how bad it's been, comes down, this liberal legal establishment that is very popular right now on podcasts and Substacks and elsewhere will tell us why the Roberts Court, oh, they got it all wrong and this is terrible and all of those things. But they don't allow that this is a hijack court, that this is what they were put there to do, and that there's a role for the public to weigh in on what should be constitutional.
Well, that's right. And you and I were talking last summer as I was writing my book about John Roberts, about one of the early interviews of Roberts after he was confirmed to the Supreme Court a few years later. He had a C-SPAN interview in which he said, if you can quote it or I can quote it, but
Yeah,
yeah, he said, basically, if people don't like it, it's just too bad. If people don't
right,
like your
exactly,
decisions, it's just
literally.
too bad.
Right,
It's just too bad is the quote. And so this arrogance that Roberts possesses, this notion that he's entitled to dictate these results, and like you said, then some in the establishment accept that as just the way it is. We're just stuck with these rulings as if we have no sovereignty as people, that we don't have a
right,
say in our contract, our governing contract, especially with a court that's been packed the way it has, the way it's been stacked in order to basically reverse our rights, limit our rights in almost every area except for two, on this expansive and really outrageous redefining of the Second Amendment, and similarly this redefining of the freedom of worship to include a right to discriminate against other people, which would be anathema if you apply that in the area of race relations, that you
right.
have some sort of religious right to discriminate. But that's what this Roberts Court has done. But to go back to Lincoln and Douglas, that idea, that was a direct, as you point out in your newsletter,
Yeah,
in the Week in Reading, which everyone should get.
thank you.
That was in direct response, in many ways, direct response to Dred Scott, the vile decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Taney, who is a Marylander, who was the Chief Justice, who wrote just a despicable decision in Dred Scott. And, recently, in the last 2 years, that decision was reprised by none other than Justice Clarence Thomas, in a decision that cited Dred Scott as a basis for another one of their extreme interpretations, the Roberts Court's extreme interpretation of the law, and Roberts went along with that. And so you have this effort to sort of reprise this period of like expanded judicial supremacy. We're already facing it, like you said. A lot of the allies have really looked to the Supreme Court to save us. When this court, I think I said to you at one point, in my lifetime, fully 75% of the judges appointed to the Supreme Court have been appointed by Republican presidents. No matter the a number of terms of office of Democrats, it's just been gamed in a way to make sure that Republicans dominate that court. But not just any Republicans that are doctrinaire, that are basically chosen with a view that they will overturn the great precedents of the 20th century that really began to breathe new life into the Constitution, that's saying things like equal protection of the law means equal protection of the law. But all of that judicial reliance, in a way, like you said, is really counter to the notion of our democracy as a democracy of the people, for the people, by the people, and not just what the court says our democracy is. And Roberts has been singularly destructive of voting rights in America, and has faced very, very few, public condemnations for his central role in that. And I think we, the people, have to make it clear that John Roberts is the author of the woes in our democracy, that he has enabled this extreme partisanship through the way he has allowed maps to be drawn, that through the way he has participated in decisions to limit, and as you said in your newsletter, almost destroy the Voting Rights Act. That is John Roberts doing, which is why, not to just shamelessly plug my book, but I'm so excited that the book is coming out, Without Precedent, about John Roberts and his role in dismantling our democracy.
Yeah. And I certainly hope anyone watching this doesn't take what I'm about to say next as letting John Roberts off the hook here. But I think to really fully grasp what's going on, we have to understand that this one guy isn't Superman, right? The reason John Roberts is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to do this is because of the billionaires who spent literally decades on law schools, on politicians, the Kochs, all the others, and allied with the furthest religious right to create this coalition to use the judiciary to do what no democratic process could ever do, right? You can't imagine a bill in Congress to let billionaires spend as much money as they want, right? You
Yeah,
couldn't imagine a bill to say it's religious freedom to discriminate. You couldn't
yeah,
imagine a bill to overturn the Voting Rights Act. They
yeah,
understood their only option, and they had literally billions of dollars that they spent to do it, to pack the court, to be able to circumvent democracy altogether. And the reason why this could work in a way that it never could before is they weren't just buying a new judiciary, they were buying a Republican Senate and House caucus as well, right? So that in prior decades, when a decision would really be outrageous, the Congress would kick back. But when you have the entire Republican caucus in pretty much in their pocket, it has basically disabled that check on judicial power. And you add to that that McConnell prevented the Garland confirmation and then ran through the Barrett one. We'd literally be sitting here 5-4 Democratic appointments without that. And again, Mitch McConnell had a big role like John Roberts. But if they hadn't put out all the money to buy most of the rest of the Republican Senate caucus, as well as law schools and, create a judicial pipeline, right? I don't think they're capable enough to do it on their own. And
right.
it's really important for us to understand that because that's how big the problem is. And that is why this really is an oligarchic coup.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And one of the books that I was reading earlier this year or last year, David Daley's Anti-Democratic, really lays that out so clearly in terms of, the circumstances around the Voting Rights Act, the fact that it was reauthorized early by Congress with an overwhelming bipartisan vote, and only a handful of Republicans opposed it. And those Republicans, they were white Southern Republicans in particular, talked about how this wasn't the end because they had 5 votes at that time on the Supreme Court to basically overturn it. And that's what John Roberts did, disregarding thousands of pages of factual finding of the need for Voting Rights Act enforcement. He unilaterally, with the help of 4 other Republican appointees, dismantled those congressional findings, contemptuous of Congress and Congress's vital role, as you point out, in protecting the popular will. There was, in fact, like you said, there was no majority to do that. There was only a majority on this Roberts court because of this decades-long court packing, this decades-long effort to capture the court. So let's end on a positive note, because I know at the very end of your newsletter you talk about some
Ah,
of the things that
right,
people can do. So
right.
let's talk about those, and then we'll have you back again, Mike. Just so value your deep thinking
Yeah,
from an
likewise. And
analysis here. Yeah,
all your work as well. I think the important thing is sometimes you hear people talking about speaking truth to power. Like the first thing we have to do is speak truth to each other, right? Because until we are clear in our own minds and with each other about what this crisis is and who's responsible, we can't make the right plans. We can't do the right things. But when we have the vocabulary, when we do see what's going on, it's really amazing what can happen. And so the first thing I say is that never, ever say that a decision that is only by the Republican appointees is a decision of the Supreme Court. It's a Roberts Court decision, right? Be careful, because we're going to see some of the cases go against Trump, with Roberts going on the other side. That is not him following the rule of law. It's that the Republican coalition is divided on that question, and the role of the court in a couple big cases before, like the Obamacare and others, it has consistently, he's gone out and made sure that the corporate side is protected,
Yep.
right?
Exactly.
And so don't be fooled. Don't get sucked in to thinking that he has changed or is doing the right thing. Although if it's the 3+2, we should treat it as a Supreme Court decision. And it's important to just always, as much as you can with the people you're with, tell them where this came from, who the Kochs, the techno billionaires, all of them made this disaster, and they are benefiting from it, right? And that's really what we need to do. And it's amazing when like a people starts to see clearly how things can change. Now, I hate to be an originalist here, but and obviously what I'm going to say is imperfect and had some imperfect consequences. But in 1775, most of the people who a year later would sign the Declaration of Independence were still calling themselves British citizens and were still looking for ways to get representation in Parliament. And then at some moment, they all decided that was not possible. And you get America, right? Nothing else changed, right? Could have been a year before, 5 years. It was when all people had the right values, came to a different understanding of their predicament and what the options were. And to face this authoritarian moment, that is the first step we have to take together.
That's right. That's right. I think also there are these tipping points, like you said, and you mentioned, where the understanding changes, where there's clarity about the crisis that we're facing, and there's a renewed or new optimism or creativity about how we can have a different path, be on a different path, and make the world a better place. And so, Mike, Exactly. It's just a joy to have you on. Thank you so much for joining the Midas Touch Network. Thank you all for coming in to be with us on Legal AF with Court Accountability Action. Please like, please subscribe, please share, please come back, and we will be sharing more as these decisions come down in terms of what people can do and how we can approach what this Roberts Court is trying to do to dismantle our core rights and how we don't have to take it. So thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Thank you.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.